Welcome to A Therapist, a Buddhist, and You, a collective solution to healing. Well, we're in episode 2. My name is Luke DuBois, co-host here with Zaw Mall.
Hello, this is Zaw.
And,
Happy to be here.
Our second episode here, and I think this one's going to be a fun one for me because I get to learn. And today we get to learn more about Zaw and the vast experience and knowledge that he can bring us when it comes to Buddhism, and specifically Theravada Buddhism, correct?
Yes.
So what does it mean to be I learned to say it that way from Zaw. We pronounce it, often we hear it in the States as Theravada. Is that, we hear that with different terms of holistic health and wellness. What does it mean to be a Theravada or a Theravada Buddhist practitioner? How does it differ from other forms of Buddhism?
Yeah, so they are definitely different kinds of Buddhism, although it originates, from one source. But the main ones are, Tibetan Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, and Mahayana Buddhism, where all these words have original meanings, But to be fair for me, I grew up and was born in Burma, and Burma has been from the ancient time as a very Buddhist kingdom, Buddhist nation, and it's part of the Burmese culture. Almost synonymous. To be a Burmese is to be a Buddhist in a way. So I'm really blessed that I grew up with all these traditions and values. But at the same time, I feel like until I left the country to come to the U.S., I feel like that's the only Buddhism that I knew, because that's also the feature of Theravada Buddhism. Theravada translates, Thera means the elders or the older. Veda or Wada in Burmese means the beliefs or the practice, so which usually is translated as, Theravada is translated as the practice of elders. And that's the purpose of the founder of Theravadas, which is that Buddhism, over time has really evolved. And Theravada's mission is to maintain to the original, because people started modifying, interpreting, extending, elaborating, commentaries. Buddhism started evolving, but Theravada is all about, no, let's not go there. Let's just stick to the originals.
Oh, it sounds like the practice of elders is another way to say, hey, here's the wisdom. Here's, would you say Theravada is more a structured form of Buddhism, or here's the foundational, true, purism of Buddhism? Would you say it that way, or am I left field here?
Yeah, it's we can explore more into that as we keep talking. But the first thought that comes to mind for me is that it is, I guess, in the world stage, it's more of a monastic tradition. Because everything goes to the original suttas. There's this thing called Tipitaka, which is 3 baskets of the Buddhist original teachings. And then, Buddhism was passed down orally for a long time until it was written down much later. And then that Tipitaka, which translates as 3 baskets, which is the core of Theravada Buddhism. And the first one is the suttas, which is the discourses. And then the second part is the monastic codes for the Sangha, the Buddhist monks, what they need to abide by. And then the third part of the basket is the Abhidhamma, which also usually is translated as the higher teachings, which is kind of like a really dried out Buddhism. So yeah, to answer your question, the structure comes from there. But also it's not as user-friendly, for lack of a better word, because it is quite monastic, very strict, very to the core. But, the other branches of Buddhism that is more user-friendly will be Mahayana and Tibetan Buddhism, which is more of, I guess from the point of view of the United States, I think those are the Buddhism that enter into the West earlier than later. And then to expand a little bit more on the words too, Mahayana, which is practiced more in Thailand and in other places too. Maha means great, and Yana means vehicle. And they refer to Theravada. I'm not sure if it's offensive, but they refer to Theravada Buddhists as Hina Yana. He means small or limited. Yana is vehicle. So they refer to Theravada Buddhists as we're the big vehicle, and you guys are the smaller vehicle, which also, attack to that point of view of limited and unlimited, But their philosophy is that, I don't want to go too deep into the technical terms and the Buddhist philosophy. But basically what they believe in is that there's going to be the future Buddha. Instead of striving for the one individual enlightenment, let's just wait until the future Buddha comes. And we'll get into this gigantic, great vehicle together with that future Buddha, and then we'll get to the place of enlightenment instead of trying too hard right now, which is pretty much Theravada Buddhism is.
And we could have a whole episode on this word, so
yeah.
Let's see if we can get it in a sentence or two. When it comes to Buddhism and enlightenment, what does that mean for you, enlightenment? That could be a whole episode.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Burmese being my native language, and then growing up with these ancient, Pali sounds, which is also part of. I was ordained as a Buddhist novice when I was 13, and my mom is from a rural part of the country where Buddhism is a lot more prevalent. So I was familiar with these terms, and these terms mean a lot to me, which also, like you said, it can be expanded into books or hours of recording sessions. But I do want to stay true to those. So when you say the enlightenment, there is a word in Buddhism, which usually is part of English vocabulary now, which is nirvana, which actually is nibbana in Burmese or in Pali. Apparently it comes from, the word comes from cooking. Nibbana means the cessation or to remove something. So people usually think of enlightenment as, it's a place that I need to get to. But it's more of a reduction, removing of the confusion or greed or
distraction.
Hatred. Yeah. So, what does enlightenment means to me is the end of suffering, which is the goal of Buddhism. Whatever suffering means to you,
Very tactful and impressive to sum it up that quick. We'll certainly expand more on how Buddhism and mindfulness and meditation can be a path to further healing and health and recovery. But tell us a little bit about, you're saying Burma, which I love that we, right now, maybe Americans know it as not Burma, but
Myanmar.
Myanmar.
Yeah, that's
so
a new name, yeah.
The reason why you call it Burma is why? Hey listeners, we've got something extraordinary to share, a chance to reshape your journey no matter where you are. You're familiar with Zalmal's insights on our podcast, but there's more. Through the Recovery Collective, he offers life, mindfulness, recovery coaching, and meditation groups guiding you toward a fulfilled and mindful existence, no matter your location. Zal's journey from a Burmese Buddhist novice to a skilled practitioner equips him with timeless wisdom and contemporary strategies. Whether you're navigating life's shifts, seeking clarity, or pursuing self-awareness, Zal's coaching serves as a compass guiding you toward success. The best part? Zal's approach centers on your growth and empowerment. He equips you with tools to tap into your inner strengths for continuous evolution no matter where you are. Ready to take that next step in your personal growth journey? Connect with Zalmal and the Recovery Collective at 240-813-8135 from anywhere in the world. Investigating in your journey reaps immeasurable rewards. Let Zalmal guide you toward resilience, clarity, and empowerment no matter where life finds you. Now, let's transition back into our conversation. Stay tuned, stay curious, and keep your journey growing.
Yeah, that's also, I think we're touching a lot on the names and the words and the sounds in this episode, which is cool. But Burma is the name of the kingdom, the country. And then when we got colonized by the British, they didn't know how to pronounce Burma, so they just called it Burma. And that's how the name originated. And then, the country has gone through a lot of difficult things. Military government, military coup, all these things. But there was an uprising in 1988, which was lots of bloodshed. But we also have lots of ethnicities within the country. Burma only represents one ethnicity. And I guess British kind of made it even more difficult since we have different tribes. They just started drawing lines, and then that's how it became a country. Gotcha. But then when we got independence, things were a little out of control because we're just a bunch of tribes in the past with one Burmese kingdom. But now we're a country. And then Myanmar is a name, I believe, that was created with that intention of, let's just make it inclusive. But also it was the name given by the military, I believe. They say Myanmar is just a poetic translation or poetic sounding word for Burma. But I do prefer Burma because in the West and some literature, also when it comes to Buddhism as well, when you see the word Myanmar, there's less of a connection because there's some literature in the West written about Burma with the word Burma. So, yeah, I don't have any personal attachment to it, but I'm used to...
Burma's home.
Yeah, Burma's home. And also maybe I'm a little biased too because I am fully Burmese, which is also one of the ethnicity. But because there are different other ethnicities as well. So I feel more comfortable with Burma and Burmese because that's who I fully am.
Makes sense to me. Well, if you don't mind taking us a little through your journey, you mentioned being a novice monk. Can you tell us how Buddhist upbringing kind of molded you, if you will?
Yeah, and I do want to connect this with what we do, Recovery Collective, because I'm really glad and grateful of my upbringing, which was a little difficult, because things were strict, and then I also had my own journey of recovering from addiction, alcoholism, and mental health stuff. So for me, what I appreciate about us getting together is me being able to translate or bridge between what I have learned in my own life and then making it available. And that's also another tricky thing about Buddhism is that I'm glad there's a term Buddhism and Buddhist, which is all a bunch of labeling. But if I truly practice Buddhism, Buddhism is about letting go. So it kind of defeats the whole purpose of practicing Buddhism if I call myself a Buddhist, And
that kind of fits part of my philosophy as a therapist is, well, what's my diagnosis? What's my diagnosis? Okay, say I label you. What does that do for you? Does that take care of the label? No. What do you want from the label? Do you want to heal? Do you want the underlying causes conditions so you can change and have health or recover your wellness? And to your point, it's sometimes those labels can certainly hinder as opposed to be beneficial. And then there's this whole aspect with mental health and insurance companies that's another time for another day. But I can relate in terms of the therapist's viewpoint of labeling and quote unquote my world diagnosing.
Yeah. To the question earlier about, the summary of my journey can be simply from the point of view of Buddhism is that it was very cultural. And my aunts, they're all really devout Buddhists. And also, as I mentioned, I struggle with addiction too. So I felt like I was never a good Buddhist because there are some precepts that I had to follow, and I was pretty much breaking all of them on a regular basis. And I feel
practice, not perfection.
I feel like it was a prerequisite to be a good Buddhist, So it was just in the background, available to me. But there is also this aspect that we started touching on in the beginning of the monastic aspect, Although I was introduced to the monastic practice because it's part of the Burmese tradition to send your teenage son to the monastery and then let them be your son to be a novice, shaving your head, wearing the robes and following 20 plus precepts, or at least 8 precepts, because as a layman Buddhist, there are 5 precepts that you have to follow and an additional for monastic. So I had that experience, but then, it was just in the background. But the turning point for me was when I finished high school. I went to this school, which is pretty much a preparation school to study abroad. And one of the professors there, he's Burmese, but he went to Yale, got his PhD, and really educated. But one of his classes at that school was Buddhist philosophy. And I've always been interested in philosophy. I like reading, thinking about different ideas. And then when I see the word Buddhist philosophy, that was like a turning point, because that's when Buddhism became more accessible from a free thinker or atheist or, more free point of view. And that's when I started practicing Buddhism. I guess it was more like an academic way, but it really opened new doors for me, because I was learning how to speak and read English, and there are some English translations of the original suttas that I'm familiar with, but reading them in English was kind of refreshing,
So it's interesting. You have your. How old were you when you were in the monastery?
I was about 12, 13.
So
yeah.
12, 13 years old, practicing that, Buddhism that way, but, the educational perspective and that was like another developmental or approach for your understanding on Buddhism, which is two forms of practicing, I guess, viewpoints.
Yeah. And then the later part of the journey, which is more recent for me, which has been quite a process, after I got sober, Buddhism became more accessible for me, because I was able to maintain that precept of abstaining from any kind of intoxicants that can cloud your thinking. So I resumed...
Poison your thinking, but yes.
So since then, I've been resuming some of the practices, And then the other thing too, I ended up settling in the U.S. After getting married, after college. And I've connected with some Buddhist mentors, American Buddhism, quote unquote American Buddhism. And it's been really refreshing, It's kind of one of those paradox. I felt the same way when I left Burma for the first time as a foreign exchange student with other people in Asia, that when I left the country, I felt like I had a better understanding of my own country, which is one of those paradoxes. When I started learning about how Buddhism is interpreted in the West and other, Mahayana Buddhism or Vajrayana, Tibetan, all these things that I'm not familiar with, but when I read them, I feel I have a better understanding of my original practice of Buddhism.
It's a different lens, right? A different perspective to it. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's also a little bit of, I am very Eastern, because I've never left the country until I was like 21. But there's also an aspect of westernized version of me that is unfolding in a way, because like I said in the beginning, it was kind of inaccessible for me, which also what comes with Theravada Buddhism, that this is the way it is and this is it, But for me, after being here, I'm like, let me be a little critical about it, without really losing my identity or sense of self with these practices. But why don't I look at it from a different angle? Is it really true? I feel I've developed more insight and more understanding of these teachings when I approach from that free thinker point of view or philosophy. So, like to connect that with the idea of collectiveness, I feel like many factors are playing with each other for me to have a better understanding of essentially, the purity of the mind or the spirituality within us that is always available. I feel like that's the goal of the true healing,
So from small car to medium-sized car. Or whatever vehicle it needs to come through. When it comes to your journey, you mentioned your mental health and recoveries from substance use, and how has, as at the Recovery Collective here in Annapolis, Maryland, you offer mindfulness coaching and life coaching through these Buddhist principles, and how do you feel, whether it's the Noble Truths or the precepts that you mentioned earlier, has helped you with your health journey, whether it's through mental health or substance use?
Yeah. So in the first episode, you mentioned the word healing, and that really got me thinking. My dad is a doctor, my mom is a nurse, and now I'm also in the healthcare field as a medical interpreter. So I see doctors, I see like surgeries on a regular basis, and then the word healing is interesting because for me, I'll connect that with Buddhist practice later. But like, people think that doctors cure, doctors treat. Like when there is injury, doctors like make them go away, treat them. But technically speaking, they just set the conditions right. The healing happens itself. So like when there is an injury, doctors do a surgery not to fix it, but to create the conditions, favorable conditions for the healing to occur, because the body does it by itself. So I feel like, not that I feel like, in my experience, it's the same thing with the mind too. So I cannot fix my mind. If there is an injury to my mind, if there is some kind of trauma, brokenness, my role as a quote-unquote doctor for my own mind is not to like, oh, let me make it go away forcefully, but it's more about what are the things that is going on, causes, and then identifying what the causes are, and then set the conditions right. And then the healing happens on its own,
Let's use a great analogy for that. You have a broken bone, you can self-diagnose yourself. Oh, my arm is broken. You can also go to a doctor, and they may set up the conditions, right? They reset the bone to be in place. They'll probably put a cast on it to immobilize it. That, elevated anti-inflammatory medications, and the idea is to set up the conditions for that bone to heal. Does it heal necessarily? Well, yeah, the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts in the bone begin to mend together, and we become Wolverine. We heal, right? But the doctor sets up the conditions, but that's only one phase to the whole recovery process. As an athletic trainer, what did I do after someone got a knee injury, a broken bone? Well, there's atrophy, right? The muscles and around it. So physical therapy and the recovery process took action. The range of motion, getting the muscle back to really set that healing and prevent further injury. So sounds like we can do that with both mental health and substance abuse recovery as well. Talk a little bit more about the conditions when it comes to Buddhism for you.
Yeah, the Buddhism that I grew up with, the Eightfold Path, which, the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths are the foundations of Buddhism in my understanding. But when it comes to the Eightfold Path, there are three categories. Although there are 8, there are only 3 categories, which many people interpret it differently, but in my tradition, they kind of go in order. That the first group is morality, or the mental or moral discipline, which has to do with the precepts that I mentioned earlier. So in a way, you're setting the conditions right. So for example, if I want some kind of true healing, and if I'm lying all the time, there is more anxiety because I need to cover up these lies when at the same time I'm trying really hard to heal, That doesn't make sense. Or if I am, killing animals, one of the precepts is to abstain from killing. Or, sexual misconduct, or getting drunk every day, and then I'm like trying so hard to heal, then I'm defeating the purpose, So setting the conditions right, for me in my training, the first part is the morality, where you set the conditions where the mind can calm down. Because when I'm truthful and when I'm not lying, my mind is a lot more calm, because I don't need to worry about my lies being uncovered, So that's the first condition. And then eventually it leads into the second category of the Eightfold Path, which is the concentration or the calmness, where the right mindfulness and the right concentration is one of 2 of the factors of the Eightfold Path. And that's where the mind can get calm and concentrated. And then it leads to the third category, which is the wisdom, right view, right thinking, which essentially comes down to the 3 characteristics of existence in Buddhism, that things are impermanent, things are unsatisfactory, and things are impersonal, And that to me is where the true freedom is, when I'm able to look at the world that way from those 3 characteristics, which is, again, not a forceful way of looking at it, but it comes to the consciousness naturally if I follow that path. So that is the causes and conditions for the freedom from suffering.
There's a lot of parallels with kind of my form of therapy that I help people with. It's how do I help empower them to identify the things that they do have, whether it's power or control over, right? So in this lens, we're talking about it as anxiety as a potential symptom, right? Of course, there could be a chemical imbalance, a genetic predisposition, and things like that. But there's a reason why anxiety can happen with people, a rhyme and reason. Well, what aspects can we help in terms of, hey, why is my mind and body feeling this anxiety? what kind of control, what conditions can I better set up as going, okay, I'm feeling this anxiety. What can I do about it? What conditions can I better set up? That way I do have, in my terms, action that I can change to minimize this anxiety. Right? And that's powerful in helping people, whether it's insight, whether it's something that they have ability to change, whether it's in the form of mindfulness meditation or talk therapy, that can be really healing.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, like the idea of mindfulness, which is what I offer at this practice, it's, I guess, mindfulness has been a pretty buzzword for the past decade or more or so.
Used a lot, yeah, used a lot.
So I don't know if it's like Buddhism in disguise, I think it's a term coined by one of the pioneers of mindfulness movement, I guess, in a way, but it is translated, in my understanding, from the word sati or tati in Burmese, which is one of the factors of the Eightfold Path. And I guess it has evolved, just like Buddhism has evolved, the term mindfulness. But in my practice, it's simply remembering. It's not like an invention. It's not like adding something new, but it's more about uncovering. Is bringing awareness to what is actually happening, So mindfulness is, English is not my first language, so I'm not going to sound like an expert of like what mindfulness means. But it's all about having a non-judgmental awareness of what is happening in this moment with the feelings, with the physical sensation. So it's more about getting rid of all the confusion, all the opinions, all the things that I think I know, but letting them aside and then really have that bare attention, bare awareness of what is actually happening.
Reality for what it is, remembering or being present for what really is, as opposed to all the other variables that I could create, whether it's an altered reality or a suffering reality, if you will.
Yeah.
A perspective.
Yeah.
So when it comes to mindfulness in your practice, what conditions help you truly practice mindfulness?
Yeah, there is a specific discourse, original Buddhist suttas, that is specifically on mindfulness, which usually is translated as Four Foundations of Mindfulness. The original title is Satipatthana. And also there's another discourse, which is more of an expansion of that Satipatthana, which is called Maha Satipatthana. Maha, as a listener might or might not remember, in the beginning, Mahayana. Maha means great. So it's more like an expansion of that Four Foundations of Mindfulness. And there are some specific instructions for that in that sutta. But for me, specifically in my practice, especially in sobriety, now is following the 5 precepts is very important in terms of setting the condition. But also for me is time and place, I do have a particular place where I practice, and that's how I practice, set a time and a place and pay attention, to what's happening. And my practices are more stillness and silence based, where again, that's when the purity of the mind comes out. The example that I usually think of is this, jar with water in it, and there's also like sand and dirt and all kinds of jar in it. And then if I keep shaking it, which is what my mind does throughout the day, I want to do this, do that, go talk to this person, make this phone call. I just keep shaking it, and I don't see anything because it's just blurry with all these dirt. But when I put the jar down on the table, don't touch it at all, which to me is silent and stillness meditation, is that when that happens, the process occurs on its own, where all the dirt, sand, whatever is blocking the view gets to the bottom.
Settles, yeah.
And I see things clearly,
So we often separate or hear, sounds like a meditation practice, right? And some people decipher or say there's a difference between mindfulness as opposed to meditation. And maybe that has evolved or changed, but maybe through the monastic viewpoint or the Theravada Buddhist way, that there might not be a difference. But can you expand on, for example, your practice is a mindful practice of consciousness and being present in the moment. Is there a difference between mindfulness and meditation in your perspective?
Yes, there is, but I think, speaking of the vehicle metaphor,
Yeah.
I feel like when it comes to spirituality and different religion, it's just a bunch of different vehicles that takes you to the same place,
Yeah.
But I do
collectively, if you will.
collectively, yeah. But I got sober, through a 12-step fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a step in that fellowship that specifically talks about prayer and meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first saw the word meditation, when I was first new to 12-step, I was like, yeah, that's it. I think I'm just going to start from that step. But over the years, I have learned that concept of meditation in, Christianity or just Western in general is very, very different from the Eastern meditation. I guess, everything is translated. So meditation is also a translation of what it means to meditate in Buddhism or in the East, But the difference that I have discovered is that meditation in the Western world comes from a place of contemplation, concentrating, When somebody's meditating, you're like focusing a lot on a particular word or the idea of God, contemplating, really concentrating, trying really hard, which is also, part of the Buddhist practice as well, the concentration part. But it all comes down to letting go, like cultivating. So I don't know if that's people's understanding of what meditation is in the West, but that's my observation of my own practice and what I have observed in Western literature and the way people talk about meditation in the recovery community.
I guess help us understand your practice of what you try to give your clients here at the Recovery Collective in terms of this form of mindfulness. What are key things that, as simplistic as you've been doing all episode, what are some initial pointers you would give someone? Because I know you often don't do guided meditations, right? You do them in silence, which can give some people concern or worry. Wait a minute, I need that guided meditation to help me, which is a very valuable vehicle for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. When it comes to your form of mindfulness, what are some of those things that you often recommend to people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I usually preface everything with, I guess mindfulness has really become a buzzword that's like an end-all be-all solution to everything, which I think is not true in my experience. So I make sure that I communicate that this is complementary to everything else that you're doing, So sometimes, mindfulness is about, again, uncovering what's there. So I would show up to my meditation practice only to realize that I'm tired and I take a nap instead of forcefully, so it's more about seeing what's happening and then taking the appropriate action, So it is a good start, for some people. They come in and do practice mindfulness meditation and they're, actually I need to go into treatment, So it's not about like, I'm going to fix all my problem, but it's more about what is actually happening, bringing the awareness. So for me...
What do you mean by that, Matt? You're guiding someone through a mindfulness practice and they have this insight or this realization, and what do you mean by that?
Yeah, it simply means, this is probably my Buddhist belief, is that the natural state of a human mind is confusion.
Okay.
That's also my Buddhist understanding, is that the driving force of all suffering is greed, hatred, and delusion, So once those are uncovered, you see what's happening, So it's more about paying attention, Sometimes, I'm just going through the day and I'm just busy with all kinds of distractions and excitements and all these things. And I think I'm not suffering, although I have a lower back pain that's been going on all day. And I'm not aware of it because I'm busy with the day. And it's causing me so much pain. And my brain knows it, but not to the conscious level. So what I mean by awareness is that when I actually sit down and start paying attention to what's happening, I'm like, oh, wow, I have this lower back pain going on. And then it makes me go see a doctor as opposed to, oh, I'm just busy with my life without being aware of it. So that's what I mean by mindfulness practice, helping you see what's happening, what's already there. Not to create more problems, but to see the original problem.
And that is so complementary or integrative with talk therapy, having a conscious awareness of what someone thinks, feels, or consciousness of why they act or react the way they do, right? I often say there's two reasons people go to therapy. There's many reasons, but two big reasons. There's a change in their life and they don't know how to change with it, or there's something going on in their life and they don't know how to cope in a healthy way, right? So when you share of, that mindfulness practice, bringing something to the conscious, well, that's what happens a lot in talk therapy. To your point, we're not conscious. We're just doing, right? And in talk therapy, we have this, we look at the brain, the cerebral cortex, it forward thinks, right? It's designed to forward think and think of the future, think of the past. And now we have a culture and society that is just built on distraction. So it can prevent us from being aware of our true self, our consciousness, that we're talking about setting up the conditions again. So expand on the we've talked in the past off our podcasts about the senses and the brain or the organ being its own.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on that, and then I'll also touch on the practical aspect of the practice, which is it all starts with paying attention to the breath. So that to me is the most essential and most fundamental part of practicing mindfulness. But before that, I also, the point that you're touching on, I think I wrote a blog on that too, on the Recovery Collective website, which is that mind is treated as an organ, which is like, we have an organ like eyes or the ears, and the purpose of the eyes is just to see light. It cannot hear the sound, so that's all it does. The eyes is there to see the light. And when there is an input of light, it sees. And same with the ears, that it cannot see light, it's just there the sole function is to hear the sound. And same thing with the mind. The mind is there for a particular reason, and it thinks that it's great at doing that. I think it is good, when it's channeled the right way, but the purpose of the mind is to generate thoughts, to think, to speculate, to project into the future, to recall memories, to worry, to figure things out,
It's how we developed as a species, right?
Yeah. So understanding that, again, it's not about creating a solution, but it's more about seeing what's happening, and then the solution appears itself in a way. And I want to tie that with the breathing too, that, going back to what we were saying earlier about bringing attention, the other metaphor that I've read or that I've heard of is that things grow in the dark, in the valley, dark valley. But when you shine light on it, or when the sunlight hits, things just clear up, To me, that's what also mindfulness and awareness is like, So, if you have time, anybody who's listening, unless you're driving, but you can even pay attention to the breath right at this moment, that we're breathing subconsciously when we're not paying attention. But if you sit still and pay attention to the breath, something magical happens, that especially if you pay attention to the breath, not necessarily breathing intentionally, but paying attention to what's happening as if you're doing it for the first time in your life. And the breath expands, you realize that, oh, there's a beginning, there's middle, there's an end to the in-breath, and there might be a pause between the in-breath and the out-breath. It's a very, very beautiful process. And I would even go this far to say that all the truth of the existence is embedded in the breath, because there's the idea of impermanence. Breathing just keeps happening. It's one breath cannot be complete and stay there. It keeps going. And then there's also an aspect of unsatisfactoriness, that there's no completion. It just keeps going, And then there's also an impersonal nature in the breath, that the breathing is keeping me alive, but it's nothing personal. The body is trying to live on, whether I allow it or not. It's going to keep breathing. So, yeah, I don't know if that's related to the question that you asked, but I just got carried away.
Well, I think that's a great example of just how something of being so mindful and present can lead to a form of enlightenment. That's kind of what I heard you explain. Focusing on the breath can give you a reality, a connection with the mind, the body, the present, right? And how, in my very little experience with mindfulness, can lead to other residual powerful experiences, right? And I know we've talked about just how some people do mindfulness or meditation and hope for something, and hope for an experience, and the way I've heard you explain it in the past, it's how would you say it? Don't expect anything from it. How would you explain that? It's like some people go, gosh, I don't get relaxed, or I need to do it for 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes, or my brain didn't slow down, or I wanted this answer, or want, right? As opposed to the practice itself is really the ultimate benefit, whatever the benefit may be. What's your viewpoint on that?
Yeah. I don't know why I'm chuckling, but it just makes me realize it's very difficult to have an ego, to have the mind as human beings, because there are also some famous prayers, and one of them is, the Serenity Prayer that's used a lot in the 12-Step Fellowship, which is that, spirituality is all about getting right size, knowing what I can do and what I cannot do. And it plays a huge role in meditation too, that it is about allowing, So if I want to meditate for 10 minutes, and if I'm like, by the end of that 10 minutes, I'm going to be the most happiest person in the world. And if I go with that mindset, it might or might not happen, but if it doesn't, it's a setup for failure, But if I go in with the open-mindedness, which also I think is a consistency being more important than the intensity in meditation, that in my practice, I pay more attention to the consistency. So what I practice today might not have an immediate effect right after that, or not even that day, but it adds up. It creates a condition for the happiness to occur, which is a slow process. So that's, I don't know if that's exactly what I have shared with you in the past, but that's pretty much it. Don't go in there with an expectation, but go in there with an open mind and see what happens, and then get right size in a way that I cannot. There's also another example that I think of related to healing that we're talking about with doctors. They're just setting the conditions. The other example that I think of, which is similar to meditation, also the word meditation in Buddhism translated from the word bhavana, which comes from because back in the ancient time when Buddha was around, it's like agricultural landscape. So he used the term bhavana, which is more to do with cultivation of the soil. So the thing that I'm thinking about is that if I am trying to grow a tree, and I would get a seed, plant it underground, and I put it in a proper place, I water it regularly, there's enough sunlight, and if I'm like putting myself in a place, I'm watering it, it's in the
expectation.
Sun. Yeah, like why is it not growing? As if I am causing that tree to grow. But if I actually sit back, I just need to do my part, and then the tree grows on its own, And same thing with meditation too. If I go in there with the expectation of like, I need to be happy by the end of this, it's like same example of I need to make this plant grow, as if I can make this plant grow. But the growth, the process happens on its own, but my job is to create the condition. To me, sometimes that means I need to be in a quiet place for this amount of time and see what happens,
Yeah, having those expectations can lead to stress, resentment, anxiety, and that's certainly a good practice. I tell people there's positive and negative expectations. Positive expectations are based on desire, something you want, and negative expectations are based on fear. And I think some people have a gift to have both positive and negative expectations at the same time. Well, you're really setting yourself up for resentments or suffering, right? In terms of some of the things that we're talking about, and helping our people find conditions to hopefully not have those expectations. You gave the great example of someone plants a tree or a garden, turning the soil, watering it, planting the seeds, do all this the right season doesn't mean it's going to grow. But I think part of healing is setting up the conditions, the things we have, and there's a spiritual piece to this whole piece, and whether it's God or higher power or spirituality, taking care of the parts that we don't have control over can be freeing and be a relief as opposed to fearful.
Yeah. Yeah, another thought, maybe this might be the final thought, which is that, of what we do here, or what I do here, helping clients, in addition to starting with the breath, there's also an aspect of loving kindness. That to me is the uniting force as a Buddhist for me, that in the whole world, rich people have rich problems, poor people have poor problems,
Sure.
but there is nobody who's not suffering at a certain level. So that to me is a uniting force as of being a living being,
Yes.
everybody's suffering. So, but once I see the world that way, there is less of an otherness that, I am this way, they are this way, as if there is a separation, So I usually help people with the practice of loving kindness, which is, I can think of any situation that is not appropriate for loving kindness, which usually comes down to, everybody wants to be happy, everybody wants to be safe, everybody wants to be free from any kind of danger, even if there's this criminal or somebody who's drinking, they're doing those things because they think it's going to make them happy. So there is no otherness, that, that person is a terrible person because he's doing that. But we're all coming from this place of, I want to be happy,
Yeah.
So that to me is also another tool. It's not necessarily mindfulness, but it can be a mindfulness practice, practicing loving kindness. Sometimes the beginning might just be, may this person be happy. It might be just a bunch of words, but usually is a very uniting force. So that to me is also another mindfulness aspect. Again, it's something that is already within us, that nature of wanting to be happy within us. And when you uncover it, you actually uncover or break down the barrier of, there is me and there is a world. But it's more like, everybody's in this together. Everybody's suffering. So let me not add more to it.
It's a healthy form of energy, if you will, putting that positive love, light, connection energy out as opposed to negative. One example I've heard before is water is an energy source. So you can water a seed, you can water a plant, and you will absolutely have an effect by that. It will grow, most likely, setting up the conditions. But guess what? Weeds can pop up too. So removing some of those weeds, and one way to do that is not be negative or hurtful or dark. I often say everybody has faith. Yeah, it could be a religious or spiritual faith, but it could be, you have faith in problem or faith in the solution, faith in darkness, faith in light, faith in positivity or faith in negativity. And that love and that positivity, I think, is a great way for us to close. It can be healing.
Yeah, and to conclude and circle all back, because we started talking about words and a bunch of sounds, so I do want to close with this, which is that I guess the word nirvana has really entered into the English language, but there's another word which is not really fully there yet, but I think many people are aware of that. Speaking of loving kindness, is the word metta, M-E-T-T-A. That to me is the essence of loving kindness. The example is, it has the calming, cooling effect, as if there's a desert and you're just so burned out and hot, and then when you get under the shade of a big tree, you get this cooling sense of calmness. And metta has that effect. If you cultivate that within you, other people picks it up, whether they know it or not. So when I drop my weapons, the world drops their weapon, and the world never had the weapons against me. Although that's when I'm in a dark place, that's what I think. The world is against me.
Yeah, we have faith in that.
Yeah. But when I drop my own weapons, I'm like, actually, nobody's trying to attack me. So metta is also another aspect of mindfulness practice that's been helping me, and then that's been helping some clients here as well.
Well, thank you, Zoe. I think we've certainly covered a little of a lot, or a lot of a little. We'll see. But please give us comments, and we'll certainly do deeper dives on precepts and noble truths and the Eightfold Paths in future episodes. Let us know if anything jumped out to you in this episode, and like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you. See you next time.